The rain beat against the windows of Ed Sheeran's home studio in Suffolk, creating a monotonous melody that only intensified his frustration. It had been 3 months since he couldn't compose anything that truly moved him. His latest attempts sounded empty, mechanical, as if his musical soul had gotten lost somewhere between million-dollar contracts and packed concerts. Ed put down his guitar and rubbed his tired eyes. At 33, he had conquered everything he had ever dreamed of in music, but something essential seemed to have evaporated. Maybe it was time to take a vacation, to think about something else. The shrill ring of the telephone interrupted his melancholic thoughts. "Ed, it's David." His lawyer's voice sounded strangely animated. "You're not going to believe what just happened in my office. You've received an inheritance." "An inheritance?" Ed frowned. "From whom?" "I don't know of any rich relatives." "That's exactly what's strange. The document only says, 'From an anonymous admirer,' and that these belongings were specifically intended for you. Everything is very mysterious, but completely legal. Can I have them delivered today?" An hour later, a black van stopped in front of his house entrance. 2 men carefully transported a guitar in a vintage case and an aged wooden crate that seemed to be decades old. Ed observed the objects in his living room, feeling a strange familiarity, as if he had already seen them in dreams. The guitar case was made of worn leather, with faded travel stickers: India, San Francisco, London. His fingers trembled slightly as he opened the golden clasp. Inside, a Rickenbacker 12-string from the 60s, in perfect condition. The varnish had that special glow that only decades of dedicated music could create. Ed took it delicately, feeling its familiar weight as if it had always belonged to him. But it was when he opened the wooden crate that his world turned upside down. Handwritten music notebooks, yellowed photographs, a sealed envelope. Everything exhaled a scent of incense and history. Ed took the first notebook, his hands trembling as he saw the elegant handwriting on the cover. "Chords for the Future, property of G.H." He opened it to the first page, and his heart stopped completely. There, written in recognizable handwriting that he had seen on countless Beatles documents, was, "For Ed Sheeran, I hope you will find in these chords what I didn't have time to complete. True music transcends time, my friend. Use it well. With affection across the years, George Harrison, November 2001. Ed dropped the notebook to the floor, the pages scattering like dead leaves. George Harrison had died in November 2001, when he was only 10 years old, and didn't even dream of being a professional musician yet. How the hell was this possible? With trembling hands, Ed picked up the pages. Each one contained handwritten chords, some incomplete, others with annotations in Sanskrit. There were also small drawings, lotus flowers, mandalas, symbols he couldn't decipher. Trying to calm his tumultuous thoughts, Ed decided to play the first progression noted. He took the Rickenbacker, connected it to the amplifier, and positioned his fingers on the strings following the notebook's indications. When he played the first chord, something extraordinary happened. The sound that resonated in the studio wasn't just music. It was as if the walls themselves began to vibrate at a different frequency. Ed felt a wave of warmth rise along his spine, and suddenly, he was no longer in his studio. He was at Abbey Road studios, but not as he knew them today. It was 1969, and in front of him was a young George Harrison, long hair and characteristic mustache, playing this same progression on a guitar identical to the one Ed was holding. "One day," George murmured to himself, eyes closed in concentration, "someone will complete this for me, someone with their heart in the right music." The vision lasted only a few seconds, but when Ed returned to reality, he was breathless and tearful. The guitar still vibrated in his hands as if it had its own life. This couldn't be real. It must be some elaborate prank, or maybe he was having a nervous breakdown. But when he looked at the notebook again, he saw something that chilled him. In the margin of the page, written in ink that seemed fresh, was a new annotation. "Welcome, Ed. Now you understand." Ed ran to the bathroom and washed his face with cold water, trying to regain his lucidity. In the mirror, he saw his pale and frightened reflection. Was he losing his mind? He returned to the living room and picked up the phone, dialing a number he knew by heart. "Hello, Paul McCartney's office." "Hi, this is Ed Sheeran. I need to speak to Paul urgently. It's about George Harrison." Half an hour later, he was on a video call with Paul McCartney, who was watching him with an intrigued expression. "Ed, my boy, you look like you've seen a ghost." Paul laughed, but his expression became serious when Ed showed the notebooks. My God, that's really George's handwriting. Paul, this is impossible. Look at the date, November 2001. He dedicated it to me when I was 10 years old. Paul remained silent for a long moment, studying the images Ed was showing through the camera. George was always mystical, Paul finally said, his voice charged with nostalgia, especially after he started studying with Ravi Shankar. He believed that music existed beyond our physical plane, that certain chords were like portals to something greater. Ed shivered. But this, Paul continued, this is extraordinary even for him. Ed, you need to talk to Anushka Shankar, Ravi's daughter. If anyone understands the spiritual paths George followed, it's her. And you also need to go to Abbey Road. There's someone there who worked with us during George's final years. The next day, Ed stood in front of the iconic Abbey Road studios, his heart pounding. He'd been there countless times, but today he felt like a pilgrim arriving at a sacred temple. Margaret Thompson greeted him at reception. A woman in her 60s, graying hair pulled back in a bun, glasses hanging from her chest by a golden chain. Her eyes were kind, but they carried a depth that spoke of decades witnessing music history. So you're Ed Sheeran, she said, shaking his hand with surprising firmness. Paul told me about the notebooks. May I see them? Ed opened the case where he had carefully stored the manuscripts. Margaret took one of the photographs. George alone in the studio playing the Rickenbacker, a serene smile on his face. I remember this session, she said, and her voice became distant. It was in November 2001, a few days before he passed. He came here alone, said he had to record something important, something for someone who wasn't yet born musically. Ed swallowed hard. What did he mean by that? At the time, we thought he was delirious from the cancer medications, but now, Margaret looked at Ed with a new expression. Now it makes sense. Come, let me take you to Studio 2. They walked through the legendary corridors, passing photographs of the Beatles, Wings, Pink Floyd. Margaret stopped in front of Studio 2's door. He spent 3 hours here that day. He recorded something on a tape, but when we came back the next day to get it, it had disappeared. George said something strange before leaving. True music always finds its way to the right hands. The studio was exactly as Ed had seen it in his vision, the same wood panels, the same arrangement of vintage equipment. Margaret took him to the control room. Sit at the piano, she said. Play one of the chords from the notebook. Ed opened the manuscript to the second page and positioned his fingers on the keyboard. When he pressed the keys, he felt that strange energy course through his body again. This time, the vision was clearer and longer. He was watching George, now older and visibly frail, recording alone in the studio. The George from the vision stopped playing and looked directly at Ed, as if he could see him through time. Ed, George said, and his voice resonated both in the vision and in reality, if you're seeing this, it means the chords worked. Music is a universal language, my young friend. It knows no barriers of time or space. George got up and walked to a movable panel in the control room wall. He carefully removed it and hid a small cassette. Friar Park, he murmured. Oriental Garden, under the Ganesha statue. When you're ready, you'll know where to look. The vision dissipated, and Ed was back to reality, panting. Margaret was watching him with concern. Are you all right? You were in a trance for a few minutes. Margaret, Ed said, his voice trembling. Do you know Friar Park, George's former home? Her eyes lit up. Of course, it's now a private property, but they occasionally allow visits from music researchers. Why? 2 hours later, Ed was driving on the winding roads of Henley-on-Thames, his heart beating hard against his chest. He had obtained special permission to visit Friar Park through mutual contacts with the Harrison family. The property was even more impressive than he had imagined. The Victorian mansion stood majestically among meticulously maintained gardens, every corner reflecting George's passion for Eastern culture. The caretaker, an elderly man named Samuel, accompanied him to the Oriental Garden. There, among small bridges over ornamental ponds and Indian-style pavilions, stood the Ganesha statue, the obstacle remover from Hindu tradition. Mr. Harrison used to meditate here every morning, Samuel recounted as they walked. He said it was his place of connection with the divine. Ed knelt in front of the green bronze statue, his hands trembling as he looked for signs of disturbed earth. At the base of the statue, he found some stones that seemed to have been moved recently, or long ago, it was hard to tell. He dug carefully with his hands, feeling somewhat ridiculous, but determined. About 12 inches deep, his fingers touched something hard and smooth. It was a small waterproof metal box. Samuel approached, curious. In all these years taking care of the garden, I've never seen this box. With trembling hands, Ed opened the box. Inside were a cassette and a folded note. He unfolded the paper and read, "Ed, if you've made it this far, it means the chords guided you correctly. This recording contains the mother melody, the source from which all others came. But beware, it can only be completed by one who possesses purity of musical intention. There's a place in London where I used to record in secret. The address is on the cassette. Go there when you're truly ready to hear what I have to say. Remember, play with your heart, not with your ego." George Ed examined the cassette. On the label was written an address in Notting Hill, and a small golden key was taped to the side. Back in London, Ed found the address, a discreet building on a quiet street. The key opened a side door that led to a staircase going down to the basement. George Harrison's secret studio was a musical sanctuary untouched by time. There were sitars, tablas, a vintage recording table from the 70s, Indian cushions scattered on the floor. The walls were covered with oriental rugs and photographs of Hindu saints. But what made Ed stagger was a photograph on the main wall, himself during a performance at a London pub in 2008, when he was still a complete unknown. On the photo, there was a red arrow pointing at him, and a word written in Hindi. Ed took out his phone and used Google Translate to photograph the word. The result made him sit heavily on a cushion. Chosen. With trembling hands, Ed put the cassette into the vintage stereo system. George Harrison's familiar voice filled the environment, but this time there was an ethereal quality, as if it came from very far away. "My young friend," George's voice resonated softly. "If you're hearing this, it means the universe worked exactly as it should. I saw you, Ed. I saw you in dreams, in deep meditations, in visions that transcended the barriers of time." Ed closed his eyes, letting himself be carried by the hypnotic voice. "I saw your pure musical soul, your ability to move millions of people without losing the human essence. I saw how you remained simple despite success, how your music comes from the true heart, not from ego." The recording paused, and Ed heard the distant sound of George tuning a guitar. "The chords I left for you aren't just music, Ed. They're fragments of the universal song, a melody that exists beyond our physical plane. It's the music that the celestial spheres sing, the harmony that keeps the cosmos in balance." Ed opened his eyes, feeling a presence in the studio, as if George were there with him. This song has the power to heal, to unite, to transform. But it can only be completed by someone from your era, someone who speaks the musical language of new generations. Someone like you, Ed. George's voice became more serious. "But there's a final test, my friend. These chords only reveal their true power when played with completely pure intention. If they're played with ego, personal ambition, or vanity, they'll disappear forever, and the opportunity will never come again." Ed felt an enormous weight on his shoulders. "You must choose, Ed. Complete these chords for your personal glory to increase your celebrity and fortune, or complete them to serve universal music, to give the world something that can truly make a difference in people's lives." The recording ended with the sound of George playing an incomplete melody on guitar. Beautiful, but clearly missing something essential. Ed remained silent in the underground studio for hours, watching the votive candles flicker, reflecting on George's words. Outside, London pulsed with its frantic life, but down there in the musical sanctuary, time seemed suspended. The temptation was real and powerful. He imagined himself launching a lost George Harrison song with his participation. The spotlights, the awards, the recognition as the musician chosen by Harrison himself. It would be the absolute peak of his career. But then, he remembered the sincere smile of a child at the first concert he had given for free at a local school. He remembered letters from fans telling how his songs had helped them through difficult times. He remembered why he had started making music, not for celebrity, but for the pure love of connecting with other people through melodies and words. Ed breathed deeply and made his decision. He returned home determined. His career had already given him everything he had ever wanted: money, recognition, the ability to provide for his family and help important causes. He didn't need more celebrity. He needed, however, to honor the extraordinary gift he had received. The following evening, Under a full moon that bathed his garden in silver light, Ed sat in the grass with George's Rickenbacker. He had brought the notebooks, some candles, and a simple recording on his phone. He breathed deeply, emptying his mind of all thoughts about success, celebrity, or recognition. He only thought about George, about universal music, about the healing power that a melody can have. He began to play the mysterious chords one by one, exactly as they were written in the notebooks. But this time, instead of trying to force a conclusion, he let his heart guide completely. And then, the miracle happened. The missing notes began to flow naturally from his fingers, as if they had always been there, waiting only for the right moment to emerge. The melody completed itself, creating something transcendentally beautiful, a song that seemed to contain all the wisdom of the universe in its perfect simplicity. When he finished playing, Ed opened his eyes and saw tears flowing down his face. The music had touched something deep in his soul, a part he didn't even know existed. He took the notebook to write down the final chords and almost screamed with surprise. On the last page, which he had checked hundreds of times and knew was blank, there was now a message written in George's familiar handwriting. "Thank you, Ed. The music is complete. Now it belongs to the world, not to us. Use it to heal, to unite, to remind people that we are all connected by the universal language of the heart. My earthly musical journey is finally complete. Yours is just beginning at a new level. When you play this song for the world, know that I'll be there in some way, smiling. With eternal gratitude, George." Ed pressed the notebook against his chest, feeling a deep peace he hadn't experienced in years. He looked at the stars and whispered, "Thank you, George, I won't let you down." 2 weeks later, Ed announced he would release a new song called The Universal Song for George. But instead of selling it or using it for promotion, he made it available for free on all digital platforms with a simple description, "A gift to the world, in memory of George Harrison." He didn't give interviews about the song's origin, didn't tell the supernatural story. Some secrets were too sacred to be exposed to public scrutiny. The universal song became a global phenomenon organically. There was no marketing or media hype, just the pure emotional power of music. People of all ages and cultures reported extraordinary experiences while listening to it. Moments of healing, family reconciliations, sensations of deep peace. Hospitals began using the song in therapies. Therapists recommended it to patients suffering from depression. Meditation groups around the world adopted it as a soundtrack for their practices. Ed observed all this with a mixture of joy and humility. He knew it wasn't his merit. He had only been the channel through which George's universal music had reached the world. 6 months later, on a quiet night in his studio, Ed was putting away George's notebooks when he felt a familiar presence. A gentle breeze passed through the closed environment, making the manuscript pages dance softly. In the air, almost imperceptible, Ed heard a whisper charged with affection and satisfaction. "Well done, my friend. Well done." Ed smiled, knowing that George had found his final piece. The Rickenbacker guitar, leaning in the studio corner, seemed to shine for an instant in the soft moonlight. From that day on, Ed never had creative block problems again. He had learned the secret that George had tried to teach him. True music doesn't come from ego or ambition, but from authentic connection with something greater than ourselves. And sometimes late at night, when the world was silent and he sat down to compose, Ed could swear he heard a second guitar playing softly with a perfect harmony coming from somewhere beyond time and space, reminding him that true music never dies. It only waits for the right hands to return to the world. And now I want to know from you, what would you have done in Ed Sheeran's place? Would you have believed that such a gift could cross time, or would you have thought everything was just coincidence? Have you ever experienced something so inexplicable that seemed to be a sign that there was something greater guiding your steps? And even more, if you received a message from the past from someone you admire, would you have the courage to see it through, even without understanding? Share your opinions and experiences in the comments. Your story might inspire someone today. If this journey touched your heart, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell so you don't miss the next stories that remind us that life goes far beyond what we can explain. Thank you for being here until the end. Your presence gives meaning to every word told.